up, founders, and welcome back to another hot take. My name is Asia Orangio, and I'm the CEO and founder of DemandMaven, where we work with SaaS businesses to define their go-to-market strategy and troubleshoot their growth. I'm here today to tell you all of the mistakes that I think SaaS founders and CEOs make as they are embarking on their journey to build their early stage SaaS company. Typically, I see this in the first 3 years or so, but I am here to tell you, I have worked with founders of all kinds of businesses, many different verticals, B2B, B2C, targeting enterprise, all the way down to targeting SMB, even consumer, pretty much every single vertical I feel like at this point. Like there hasn't been a single kind of SaaS company that I haven't worked with except for maybe like large scale social media companies. And when I tell you I see this over and over and over again, I mean it. So I am basically just going to run through this list really quick, partly because I get really pumped whenever I'm able to speak to you in many ways from the future, because hopefully if I tell you about these things, I can help you avoid them entirely, and you won't make that mistake because I caught you at the right time. Okay, number one, they spend way too long in their analytics debt. Now, you might have heard of a term called technical debt, especially if you are a technical founder or if you work with an engineering or development team. You probably have heard the term before. Technical debt basically just means the way that you have coded something doesn't age really well and causes a lot more problems in the future. It might make the product or app slow or buggy or what have you. And usually technical debt, incurred technical debt, basically just means, well, instead of recoding it or spending the time to make this particular thing better, we're just gonna live with it and deal with it and take on the technical debt, knowing that at some point we'll have to pay it off in the future eventually. But sometimes technical debt can be detrimental to the overall product or business's success. It can sometimes even crush a company. It just really depends on the situation. Analytics debt is really similar to technical debt. It basically just means that you go on a really long time not being able to measure anything, and then it comes back and it crushes you later. And the reason why is because you don't necessarily have all of the data at hand necessarily. You haven't necessarily been parsing it or using it in any kind of meaningful way. And then when it comes time to actually make decisions based off of analytics, you don't have it because you didn't do anything regarding it. And it absolutely sucks. I highly recommend avoiding this if you can. But it basically just looks like we don't know what our free trial to paying customer conversion rate is because we've never taken the time to set up subscription metrics properly. And sometimes that can also mean in the future that we can't make really good decisions about how our funnel is performing because we don't necessarily know how this thing is doing anyway. Analytics debt can also look like we've gone 3 years without ever installing any kind of website or traffic analytics. We have no idea how our website is performing in general. We've never coded events inside of our product, so we can't measure how well our product is doing. We also don't even know what to measure when it comes to our product. I mean, it can go on and on and on, even down into things that seem really simple and basic, like, well, we don't really know exactly how much MRR we have because we've never configured subscription metrics or Stripe properly or whatever. Like it could go so far. This hole is deep, I promise. Analytics debt, it's one of those sneaky things that can kind of kill you later, and you're just like, oh, I have 3 months left to live and I can't measure anything. If that sounds like you, please kick your analytics debt. It's a bad habit. It's a terrible habit. It's just like excessive credit card debt. You start and then you kind of do a little bit to put it off, but you never end up paying off, and you end up spending more just to have the debt hanging around, and it's terrible and it's awful. And analytics is actually a beautiful thing if you know how to use it, and also if you have a good strategic partner to actually help you make sense of the whole thing. So kick it if you can. It's bad. Okay, another one. Huge mistake. It's bad. Like, it's another one of those things where it's like, ooh, don't do this. But waiting too long to define your go-to-market and or marketing or growth strategy. I use those terms, I hate to say synonymously, but I use those terms in some ways interchangeably, but really growth. Don't put off how you are ultimately going to grow and planning and thinking for that. In the early stages when you are pre-product, usually the ultimate goal is to just get the product live. And of course you could be thinking about go-to-market and growth in those stages. But usually efforts can get kind of spread thin, especially if you don't have the resources So usually I recommend focus on just getting the MVP out, and then after that, let's really start crafting and refining and honing what this future trajectory for the product is going to be once you start to get to the place where you've got an MVP. But after that, don't wait like 5 years to define your growth strategy. I see this really often, but a lot of founders will wait until they have like 3 months of runway left in the bank, and then they call someone like me and they're like, help! And it sucks, but it's kind of like, I mean, the only way to really make it out of that hole is to take dramatic, desperate action. And that's one of those scenarios where it's unfortunate to be in. And if you can avoid it, I highly recommend it. So just don't wait until you have like 3 months or 6 months left to live. I usually recommend having at least 1 to 2 years of some kind of runway, so that way you have enough time to really understand what your growth strategy should be, and you have enough time to invest in short-term and long-term strategies. The reality is that you're gonna need both. Otherwise, you're gonna just be running on short-term, and eventually you'll hit a place where the short-term, it diminishes over time, and you really need the long-term things to kind of keep you just alive and eventually into a place where you're ultimately thriving. So don't wait too long to do your go-to-market or growth or marketing strategy, whichever word you want to use. Whatever gap or blank is there for you, ensure that you fill it. Don't wait too long. I do believe that there is such a thing as too early, but when you get into that sweet spot of, okay, it's time to start putting some pedal to the metal and wheels to the pavement, it's a good time for that. So, and then of course, definitely don't wait until you have like 3 or 6 months left to live, because that doesn't make sense either. Like, don't do that to yourself or to anybody else, because it sucks. Like, a lot. Okay, here's another one. Lack of vision or focus for the product and the business itself. This is one of those tricky ones, because when you're, especially in the early stage days, when you don't necessarily know exactly like what kind of product or business you want to be, because you're still learning, you're still maybe entering into a relatively new market for yourself. This is one of those things where it can be kind of tricky, because you don't necessarily have to have like the clearest vision in terms of what it is that you want to be. But I will say that you do still need to have a really clear vision for what you want to achieve or accomplish. Otherwise, we are rudderless, we are directionless, and bringing anyone into the business also kind of is a little bit rudderless and directionless too, especially if they're not really clear on what it is that the business wants to achieve in the first place. But I would add to that, where eventually, especially founders as their businesses grow and they take on other contractors or full-time employees, even department heads and leaders, executives, eventually you get to a place to where you go from founder to CEO. And once you make that transition into CEO, you find that you really need to kind of have a vision for what the whole point of your business is in the first place. Like, why are we here? What are we ultimately doing here? Who do we want to be in this market? Why? All of those things directly impact not only what you end up doing, but the performance upon which you do it. It might sound really fluffy and kind of, I don't know, maybe this isn't shocking, and maybe it does sound kind of soft, but when you have a really strong vision as a founder, it actually gets really easy to align all of your resources, team members, and even yourself if it's just you. It gets much easier to accomplish that. And also, I find that when teams have a really clear vision for what the business is ultimately trying to achieve or become, then the goals usually align as well. And also, those teams are usually more motivated to actually accomplish them because they have a framework and a foundation for which they can ultimately conceive of what it is that they're even here for in the first place. A vision is a beautiful thing. I highly recommend it. Okay, this is the last one I'm gonna leave you with, but it's another one. It's another one of those ones. Too impatient to invest in long-term strategies. I wish I could sing this from every single rooftop in like the SaaS world. It's one of those things where hindsight's always 20/20. You don't know until it's too late usually, or you don't know until it's already happened. And then you look back and you're just like, well, crap, I would have done all of that differently. And usually it has to do with a number of factors. Either the founder or the CEO is too impatient, or they don't necessarily have the means, the resources, or even the runway to invest in long-term just strategies in general. And this is one of those things, again, where it really depends on your situation. But if you can, when it comes to growth, there's short-term strategies and then there's long-term strategies. They're the things that you can execute and usually see a quick turnaround in like 3 to 6 months. And then there are the things that you invest in because it's going to take you through the next 2, 3, and 5 years. It's a really common mistake, and it's one that I wish everyone would avoid forever. But at the end of the day, you really need both. If you focus entirely on short-term wins and implement only short-term strategies, then you'll always be running on 3 to 6 months forever. And it gets, on the one hand, like it's like really addicting because it's like, oh, I can just like do this and like usually I'll see the result. But eventually you'll hit a wall. And the wall basically says, I've maxed out everything I can do having done what I've done so far. And if those things are pretty much always short-term strategies, then you can usually expect maybe short-term wins and sometimes even smaller gains in general. I mean, it just really depends on what it is, but sometimes the gains aren't that great either. Again, totally depends. And I hate having to say that, but it's true. Long-term, however, so long-term strategies, these are the things that you do day in, day out. They may or may not scale. It completely, I mean, it just depends. Like I can't, it's tough to just generalize here. But from a long-term perspective, these are the things that usually take you through the next 2, 3, 5+ years. One of the most perfect examples of this is actually SEO and content marketing. It's one of those things where in the early days, getting traffic is really hard to come by, and a lot of growth strategists, consultants like myself, will usually use tools, short-term tools, like let's say paid acquisition, to get traffic pretty quickly. Also so we can learn from it, of course. But the true long-term play would be to, yes, invest in the short term, but then to also use that to influence the long term. So paid acquisition plays really nicely into that long-term content marketing and SEO strategy. And SEO is one of those things where, depending on the market that you're in and the product that you have, the customer you're targeting, you might see results in months, maybe even years even, it's possible. And then also, you could see results in as little as a few weeks. It just, like I said, it runs the gamut in a way. But all in all, never investing in long term, it basically just means that you're always running what feels like empty, and it also can exhaust the team as well. It can also burn out the team, especially if you're working with others. You're always gunning towards these short-term wins, and implementing only short-term kind of means that your team is running on this just constant cycle of short-term iteration. But if it's not balanced out with long-term, it gets really hard to see where everything is going in the first place. Long-term investments, again, these are the things that really take you through the next 2 to 5 years. But if you never invest in them, then you get to that 1 and 2 and 3 year mark, you look back and you always wish that you had. It never ever fails. The regret framework is very real when it comes to those kinds of long-term strategies. I've never met a founder who's never wished that they hadn't have invested in something like that years ago. You know, knowing what they know now and where they're at now in their journey, they almost always look back and they think, wow, I could have done that totally differently and probably would have been further along as well. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this was helpful. As per usual, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. I will absolutely get back to you. And then, yeah, if you don't want to miss another hot take, please hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.